Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to be here sharing a bit about my experiences with teaching and learning, and I appreciate you taking the time to join me today. It's definitely an honor to be here, so thank you. My name is Katherine Cramer. I'm in my 10th year of teaching here at Wichita State, and I'm also in my 10th year as program chair for English education in the School of Education in the College of Applied Studies. And that means that I have the privilege of preparing future middle and high school English teachers. So that is my kind of teaching context where I'm coming from. And our agenda for today, I'm going to share a little bit more about that teaching and learning context so that you have a sense of where these ideas take place, I guess, in my teaching. I'm going to talk a little bit about crafting a vision for my teaching. And then, as I was kind of preparing for today's presentation, the title of my presentation I realize is not super flashy. In fact, I'll kind of go back to it. Teaching and learning, setting expectations, building relationships, and designing effective instruction. It's not flashy by any means, but I feel like it covers ideas that span across content areas and disciplines and different teaching and learning contexts. So as I was thinking about setting expectations, building relationships, and designing effective instruction, I realized that probably kind of the first day of class is a good starting point for thinking about these elements, and then beyond the first day of class, looking at ways that we continue to communicate those expectations and nurture relationships and continue to design effective instruction for our students. I've provided you with kind of a handout that is, you probably may not be able to see very well right now in the darkened studio, but it's intended to be kind of a roadmap for where we're going today, a space for you to jot down notes if you so desire, and also a space for you to reflect on your own teaching practice as we move through this presentation. The other thing I'll say about these categories that I've devised for this presentation is that they're certainly not mutually exclusive. As you set expectations, you are also building relationships, and that is an important facet of designing effective instruction. So you'll see overlap, I feel like, in the examples that I'm going to share with you. So we'll begin first with just my teaching and learning context, so you know where I'm coming from. I am a former middle school English teacher, and I taught at Argentine Middle School in Kansas City, Kansas. And that was before going on and earning my PhD. And now I teach here at Wichita State, and I teach 4 different English methods courses. Most of those courses have juniors and seniors as the students in the class, and they are all face-to-face, but I do put all of my content on Blackboard. I took the Quality Matters training a few years ago, and so all of the content is available and accessible on Blackboard. I also supervise 3 practicums or internships that are associated with the methods courses in my classes. Those are also juniors and seniors, and those include observations of students via video and giving feedback to them on their teaching, and then also going and observing them in local schools and conferencing with them afterward. And each of those classes and practicums has approximately 15 to 25 students. So I'm not teaching big lecture halls. And so as you think about your own teaching and learning context, think about how you might adapt some of the ideas that I'm sharing with you today to your own context. So the first thing I wanted to share with you is just this idea of kind of crafting a vision for my teaching. And I kind of just asked myself, what guides my design of my program, including the courses, the practicums, and the internships. What am I trying to accomplish as a teacher educator beyond the individual course outcomes, beyond licensure standards for my program, and even beyond graduation for my students? And this is something that I just try to keep at the forefront in my curriculum design and also in my teaching. So I'm going to share that vision with you today, and also recognize that it is evolving. So it's not something that's set in stone, but as I get feedback from students and as I assess my own practice, it's always growing and changing. So my current vision is to prepare middle and high school English teachers who possess deep understanding of English language arts content, pedagogy, diversity, equity, and social justice, who design research-based instruction that is responsive to students' needs and identities, who engage in continuous professional inquiry, and who demonstrate critically informed and generous leadership in English education. So this is kind of the end goal as my students move out of my program and into the field. And I keep this posted where I can easily see it as I'm planning instruction, designing courses, designing individual class meetings, as I'm grading their work and assessing their learning. I just want to keep this in mind. And then just as a side note, as I'm assessing kind of their major projects each semester, I'm often thinking back, like, is this assessment actually doing what I intended it to do in this vision? So I also share this with my students. I try to make my curriculum design and intentions transparent to them, which makes sense because they are future teachers. And so I see a lot of my colleagues in the audience today. We're preparing future educators, and we try to make our practice very transparent to them. So I'm going to move on and get into kind of this idea of the first day of class. And it's certainly an opportunity, as you all know, to build relationships with students, to set those initial expectations, and to design effective instruction that helps students to begin to develop a sense of curiosity and some initial understandings about course content. And so I'm going to be sharing specific examples from my practice from different courses that I teach. So you're going to be seeing different, I use a lot of slides in my classes because I like to provide a visual for my students in addition to me sharing information with them. So we're going to move through each of these examples, and we're going to talk about the ways, kind of just the structure of my first class meeting and how I try to develop relationships with my students and set those initial expectations. So to begin, the first slide that students will see in any of my classes is going to kind of welcome them into the room as they're sitting down and getting settled, or as is often the case in Corbin Education Center, students may arrive well before the start of class and be socializing with one another as I arrive. But the idea is that from the get-go, before class has even officially begun, they can see that I've got some expectations for them and a welcome for them. So I do have them just create a little note card with their name and their pronouns, and we'll use those throughout the semester. But right from the start, as soon as they've designed that note card, I'm able to begin to walk around and start putting faces to names while they're still working on whatever task I have assigned to them from the beginning moments of class. And then that initial task that I assign is what I call a ticket in the door. This is probably familiar lingo for educators, but just kind of getting some information from them about who they are as learners and as human beings. So I'm going to go ahead and share some examples of those tickets in the door so you get a sense of what I am talking about. But generally speaking, what you'll see in these examples is that I'm asking students for their names and their pronouns, and then experiences and knowledge related to the course itself, related to the internships they may be experiencing, or just some personal information that they would like to share with me, as well as any needs that they would like for me to be aware of. So this first example comes from my young adult literature class, which I recognize on that screen. You probably aren't able to see it very well, so I'm just going to walk you through it. At the very top is just kind of that demographic information, names, where they're from, what their major is, because not all of the students in some of my classes are necessarily English education majors. Any needs that I should be aware of so that they can privately inform me if there's something that they would like for me to be aware of in terms of any kind of adaptations I should make in class. And then in this class, because it deals with young adult literature, I want to know more about their reading experiences. So the prompts that I have are, what kinds of reading do you like to do? What do you know about young adult literature? Do you enjoy young adult literature? Do you remember reading it as a teenager? And then what are you currently reading? So I want to know who they are as readers, not just for school purposes and what they're assigned to read, but also encouraging them, especially as future English teachers, to be reading widely and not just what's required. For my Core 2 English Methods course, This one has a little bit different information. It's got kind of the same demographic information at the top, but then I want them to tell me about their previous practicum. So in the semester before they've done their Core 1 practicum, I want to know what that experience was like because I placed them in that experience, but I didn't teach them for that experience. Someone else teaches that class. So I want to know, what did they feel like they were successful doing? What challenges did they encounter? I also want to know, question number 4, what other teaching experiences do you have? And then 5 is more kind of the personal questions because I may not have met these students before. So what do you enjoy doing outside of school? And then, because again, these are students that I may or may not have had previously in the young adult literature class, I want them to state some goals for the semester, whether it's personal goals, academic goals, or even professional goals, so I can get a sense of what they're hoping to achieve. And then finally, my last example here is for my seniors who I would be seeing right after summer vacation, and they're coming back. They've had 1 or 2 classes with me already, so I already know them. So then just telling me about your summer, what have you been reading for fun lately? So again, as English teachers, I want to know that they're doing some reading outside of what's required. What kinds of writing do you like to do? Because again, as English teachers, we should be writing alongside our students. And then my next question is just how is their Core 3 teaching internship going? Because by this point in the semester, they have had at least a few days in that internship, and I've met with them and their mentor teachers, but I want to know, are you having any concerns? Is there anything that I should be aware of? And then of course, always that question, do you have any needs that I should be aware of so that I can help you be successful this semester? So that's what the ticket in the door looks like. That's what students are working on as they come into class and as I'm kind of walking around, maybe interacting with them, trying to put faces to names with the little name cards. And when we get to the building relationships section of my presentation today, I'll talk about how I use those tickets in the door. So then after they've completed their tickets in the door, then I do take time, and this may sound really traditional, but I want everyone to introduce themselves. And so I give a brief introduction of myself based on what the prompts were on the ticket in the door. So if it's my young adult lit class, I'm going to focus on what I've been reading. If it's my Core 2 class, I'm going to focus on some of my teaching experiences and also just kind of giving them a little bit of background on me, who I am as a professional, my education background. And then I want to go around and have each of them introduce themselves and tell us their preferred name, tell us anything they would like to off of their ticket in the door. So that's given them some time to kind of reflect and think about what they would like to share. And then you'll see in my screen over here that I do encourage them to limit their sharing, because in my classes, my students do tend to, they like to share their stories, which I think is wonderful. But I do have an agenda that we're trying to move through. And so I let them know that, share for a couple minutes, and then you're going to have plenty of time throughout the semester to continue telling us your story. And so then we move on to, let's think about how to be successful this semester. And so this may probably seem like common sense to all of us as educators, but I think making this very explicit to students is helpful. It's been helpful in my own practice. And I'll just briefly kind of provide some explanation for some of this. So encouraging students to know what the expectations are of the course. I encourage students to inform themselves first based on documents that I've shared, whether it's the syllabus, whether it's the Blackboard site that I've painstakingly designed and tried to make accessible to them, making sure that any questions that they pose to me or to their peers demonstrates an informed understanding of what is already out there. And then also communicating. So in our field in teacher education, not only can students sort of stay in contact with one another and with the teacher of the course, but also with their mentor teacher. And so I tell my students, if there is a concern that you have or something that you're feeling a little bit worried about, let's address it now rather than waiting until it has become a big problem. And I think our students, especially in this field where they're going out into internships, can feel a little bit intimidated in expressing any concerns. And so I want to make sure that, that they feel comfortable doing so. The other piece of advice that I give them is just to exhibit the qualities of a good teacher. So they're all going to become English teachers for the most part, and so be here, be on time, be prepared. I do remind them that this is a methods class and that it is intended to be for your professional development. It's not a hoop to jump through. Sometimes that can be a perception of some courses that, I just got to get through this, but I want them to be enthusiastically engaged. And then finally, a piece of advice that I always give students in every class is make sure that your presence on social media is one that you would not be embarrassed to have your future employers see. So then we also take a little preview of the syllabus. We don't go through it word by word, but I just highlight a few things for them. We take a look at the Blackboard site, which I'm going to briefly share with you. And I try to give them kind of a sense of what the expectation is for the course. So this is my Core 3 class. So my students have had their previous semesters in Core 1 and 2, they've had English courses in the English department, and I want them to know that you need to be synthesizing all of that information. You need to be applying it, not just to your lesson design in my classes, but also in your teaching performance when I observe you out in the field. And you need to be demonstrating that when you reflect on your own practice. And that would include when we have a conference after you teach, you should be able to analyze your performance and to tie it back to the readings and the work that we've done in our classes on campus. Same goes for the internship. This is for the Core 3 teaching internship. This is a slide. Again, these are all slides that I show in my classes. So in this one, I'm being particularly stringent about making sure that they are attending their internship or their placement and that they are communicating with the appropriate people if they have to be absent. Because this is something that I have dealt with, particularly in my first year here. It kind of surprised me. So now I just make sure I just preempt any of that confusion about who you need to contact and how important it is that you stay in touch with any of your mentors when you're in your internship. And you can also see at the bottom, we've got this email and communication literacies. I won't pull up the document here, but I show my students an example of a really poorly written email that I received a few years ago from an intern. She was out in the field. She was going to be absent from her placement. She was teaching, so that means she had taken over and assumed responsibility of the class, and her mentor teacher had stepped back. And the only email communication we received was, "I'm not feeling well and will not be in." And so the mentor teacher who has stepped back from the teaching may not have had the lesson plans, may not have had the materials that particular intern was using to teach the class. And so I am very clear with my students that when you are going to inform us that you're going to be absent, you need to articulate the ways that you have prepared the classroom and sort of like left substitute teacher plans to make sure that we're all, feeling comfortable with your absence and that those students in that school are not going to be left without a lesson plan and some effective teaching that day. So on the first day, I do want my students to be familiar with our Blackboard site. So I just have a screenshot here, which probably you can't see very well on that screen, but I just show them that we've got kind of some overarching information on the Start Here page, and that includes just information about the course, information about how to navigate the Blackboard site, and a reminder too that the methods course and the field experience are two separate courses and therefore have two separate Blackboard sites. So you're not going to find all the information for both courses in one site, nor are you going to find your grades for both experiences in one site. They're going to have to navigate both of them. And then after a week or so of class, I make the course menu our landing page so that students don't have to see that Start Here page every time they go into Blackboard. And then this is just kind of the main page where they can find any other information that they might need. So in this example, they've got the syllabus right up front and center. They've got WSU policies and procedures, a link to that. And then there's a folder for assignments. The next folder down, the daily agendas and materials, is a folder where I place materials from every class meeting. And I do that for two reasons. I want students to be able to access anything that happens in class when they are absent. But then I also want students to be able to take what I share with them and adapt it for their own teaching practice. So I do a lot of modeling in my class, and so being able to just have them go into Blackboard and take what they would like and use it is something that is important to me. So the next thing I do is I preview the text that I've selected for the course. So this is my Core 2 class. I've got a curriculum design book, and I basically just try to help students understand, what is my rationale for selecting this book? What are they going to get out of it? Why is it important? I also give little clues like how do you pronounce the author's names so that when we talk in class, they can speak with a sense of authority. Another book that I use in my Core 2 class is a young adult novel that deals with some important and relevant issues today. And in that class, I have not only English education majors, I also have world language education majors. And so just providing a rationale for why I think young adult literature is important for any teacher, not just English teachers, to be familiar with. And that has been well received. Students seem to approach our course texts more enthusiastically when I provide sort of a preview and a rationale for why I've selected them, as well as any kind of reading tips or strategies for approaching those texts if they might be more challenging. And then finally, on the first day, we engage with content. I think it's really important in my own practice anyway to use every instructional minute possible. And so my students do not leave early on the first day, or at least I don't plan for them to. I plan for every moment when I design a class meeting. And so they become very accustomed to the fact that they're going to get their money's worth. That's how I look at it. So in my young adult lit class, for example, that first one, we on the first day define young adult literature. I do a lot of book talks. We do a book tasting because students are going to be, one of their required texts, actually many of their required texts are self-selected young adult novels. And I have different criteria for how they select them, but they get to choose. And so I want them to have lots of sort of opportunities to explore those texts before they make a choice for themselves. And so we do things in class, but then we also go over to the library and we explore the wonderful collection over there. And I've noticed in the last 3 years since I've been taking students to the library on that first day, my students' selection of those 9 or 10 novels of their choosing, they have risen in quality. And also they are more contemporary because my classroom library that I have in my office, I am not able to keep up with purchases of, the most recent award winners, but you know what, the library does. And so that's been quite a find for me and a great collaboration too. So my students get to kind of go into that space, explore those books, and then we return later in the semester and do some research, some scholarly work related to young adult literature, and that's been fantastic. In my Core 2 class, my English Methods 2 class, my students begin setting up their professional blogs on the first day of class. They begin thinking of themselves as teacher scholars who are engaged in continuous inquiry and who are going to share the results of that inquiry to an authentic audience via their professional blog. And then in my English Methods 3 course, those are my students who are now in the teaching internship full-time. They're out in schools full-time. They've had 3 classes with me already, so we know each other pretty well. And so in that first day, we just begin by reflecting on how the internship is going. What stresses are they facing? What anxieties are they facing? And we look at some poetry, including this poem called Relax by Ellen Bass. And just this idea that, you're probably anxious about a lot of things. You got your job search coming up. You've got your, this teaching internship that you're probably kind of stressed and nervous about. You've got your licensure exams. You've got your licensure performance assessment. And so we do some writing. And when we do writing in all of my classes, because I do believe that, English teachers should write with their students, and I want my students to view themselves as writers. And so the very first day of this course, we are doing some writing together and talking about that internship. So then now let's talk about after the first day. So this is kind of on the back side of your handout if you're able to see that. But after the first day, we're going to continue to communicate those expectations and then possibly reteach them. I found that there are going to be some things that maybe you explain on that first day of class that students are going to forget or choose to misremember in some way. And so So it's important to reteach, and it's important to model that, at least in my field, because my students are going to be going into middle schools and high schools where their own students will need to be retaught expectations. And then also to continue to nurture relationships with students, and of course, design effective instruction. So we'll begin with setting expectations and clearly communicating them. So for me, clearly communicating those expectations helps me and my students stay focused on learning. So when everybody knows what's supposed to be happening, then we can just get to the heart of, the content and the questions that we're trying to answer. So this begins on day one, but it continues every class meeting thereafter with review and reteaching as needed. And I'm going to give you 3 examples from my practice that you can perhaps adapt for your own practice. So one of the big things that I'm kind of a stickler on is just setting expectations for attention and engagement in my class. And so this is an example from my young adult literature class. And this is, once we're into the semester and I've modeled this a little bit, my students then begin taking over and giving some book talks on some of the young adult literature that they're reading. And in this case, these 3 students are going to be presenting today. And so I just let students know up front that, okay, make sure you've put away anything that's going to distract you. And that includes devices, any kind of phone or your computer. You don't need to have that out during book talks. And there are exceptions. I do have a student that uses his phone for medical purposes, so I recognize that. But for the most part, get rid of things that are going to distract you. The other thing that I have learned over the years is that it's also important just to state, please don't do anything that's going to be distracting to the presenter or to your classmates. And the example that comes to mind right now is that, students may like to eat in class, and I have no problem with that. Most of my classes are 3 hours long. Go ahead and eat. But don't crinkle up your, chip bag in the middle of someone's presentation. That's something that, is a distraction both to the presenter and to the people sitting around you. Another example, I'm just going to focus kind of on the bottom element of this slide. This is from my Core 2 English Methods class. This is some explanations of what the students need to be doing as they walk in the door. And this just has been really, I need to just be very explicit. So prepare to silence and put away your cell phone and any other distracting device when class begins at 2:30. And this just comes from walking around my class and, seeing students who have their phones out and they're twiddling around while they're supposed to be engaged in other things. And that's not fair to our learning environment. And, I just encourage them to remove those distractions. Some more kind of very explicit expectations for attention and behavior. So this is also from my Core 2 class. My students do micro teaches in this class where they teach a small lesson to the class and then we give feedback afterwards. So you can see that we've got the teacher listed, we've got in-class peer reviewers listed. We've always got students on deck in case a peer reviewer is not present to give that written feedback. And I'm going to focus on item number 3 here. So when my students get done teaching the lesson, then we take about 5 or 10 minutes and they receive oral feedback from the class, and they also receive some written feedback from 2 classmates. And then they'll also receive detailed feedback from me in writing by the following week. And what I find sometimes is that some of my students, when they start getting feedback from their peers, what they want to do is explain, like, well, this is why I did this, or this is why I did that. And that's great. I mean, it's always interesting to hear your rationale, but what happens is they end up not being able to receive very much feedback because they spend so much time talking us through why they did what they did. So I just encourage them, take some notes. Take the feedback, listen. And this is good practice because when they are getting feedback from their mentor teachers and when they're getting feedback from their university supervisors, sometimes it's good just to listen and not be on the defensive about why you did what you did. Here's another kind of example of expectations for attention and engagement. So this is from my Core 2 class as well. So this Core 2 class is one of the students' earliest experiences with me, and so just kind of setting the expectation for when we are engaged in a small group discussion in particular, what I'm expecting to see. So item number 1, having your notes and text available and accessible to you so that you can refer to them and come to the dialogue from an informed perspective. And it's surprising how many students maybe will just sit there with nothing in front of them and sometimes not come to the dialogue from as informed of a perspective. And they also are going to experience that in their middle and high school classrooms, where they need to specifically encourage their students, please take out your book so that you can refer to the text, so that you can cite evidence from the text. So I'm trying to model that for them as well, in addition to encouraging the kind of engagement and attention that I want in my classroom. I'm also just going to point out that item number 4, this one has been really important in my Core 2 class. So in each of my classes, students come to class with different types of preparation from the reading. And in my Core 2 class, I have my students type a written response to the reading, think about how they're going to apply it to their own practice, kind of generate their own understandings, and then bring it to class, typed, hard copy. And then when we're discussing in class, they can handwrite new understandings directly on that. So they don't turn it in to me until the end of class, because I want them to be able to refer to it, first of all, and look at the notes and ideas and understandings that they brought to class. But then they may get some clarification in class, right? Like they may say, oh, I thought this, but now I realize. And so jotting that down so that when they then hand in their paper to me later, I can see, oh, this was the perception that they had or the understanding they had in their own reading and their own kind of trying to work through and grapple with these ideas. But now, after class, or because of class, they've got some new understanding. So I made that really clear. In fact, this is what I shared with my students on Wednesday this week. And when those students turned in their papers to me, several of them had lots of writing on them. And I was like, that is great. Thank you so much for clarifying your understanding. I'm looking forward to reading this. I also, remind students about what needs to happen in discussion, and this evolves over time as I see, what happened in today's small group discussion, what do we need to work on in future discussions. So the ones that I'll highlight here are, I'm going to just highlight number 4 here actually, to allow for divergent thinking and allow for disagreement. Our future teachers can be very passionate about their ideas, and sometimes I've had experiences where students kind of get into disagreements with one another. And so I just want students to recognize that, you don't have to agree. There's lots of room for different views and different stances on pedagogical practice. So try to maybe just listen and try to understand the other side instead of just arguing your own view. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is the feedback that I give on informal, in-class written responses. This comes from my young adult literature class. In that class, students don't arrive to class with a written typed paper that they've responded to the reading to. Instead, the type of assessment or informal assessment that I do in that class, students come to class having read and they've marked up the text and they've got their notes. And then in class, I'll have them do some in-class writing about the text, and that will prepare them for the discussion. And that in-class writing can take any number of forms, but I always have them turn it in at the end of class, and then I respond to it. So you can see here that I may underline things or mark the text. I may respond with my own thoughts. And then I'm going to use a system to communicate how effectively you've demonstrated your understanding of the reading or the ideas. So I've got a little system of a check plus, a check, or a check minus, and what each one means. And that's helpful, but I feel like it's also helpful to give them some examples. And so what I'll do is I'll take examples from the previous week and I will show them. And I don't give names. I don't say, this is so-and-so's. But this was a response to the first prompt regarding an article that we had read. And here's what a check plus looks like. And just showing them this is what one student had to say, this earned a check plus. And then I'll do the same thing for a check. This is what a response looks like when you're getting kind of a B grade. And then this is really kind of unacceptable. It doesn't demonstrate understanding of the text. It doesn't demonstrate very much deep thinking about it. So you need to step up your game a little bit. And this is helpful. I do this immediately following the first set of responses, so they get a sense of my expectation, and then I always see improvement. So what they turn in that day after seeing this, they are putting a lot more thought and intention into their responses to the text. And then finally, in terms of just setting expectations, I like to just make sure students can see what's on the horizon. So even though I have a detailed calendar that students can look at and check things off, I always like to finish the class with just reminders about what's coming up. And not just what's coming up for next class, but also what's coming up kind of on the horizon. So just looking ahead so they can see some of the bigger assessments that are approaching, and just be mindful of that. And the same goes for my classes that have a methods course and then an accompanying practicum. Just being able to see, okay, what's happening in our class, what's happening in the practicum out in schools, what do I need to be thinking about? And then this just happens to be, this was for my first day of class, last week actually for Core 2. So just this academic life portion at the bottom, just encouraging them in that first week to bring together all of the deadlines, all of the things that are going to be happening this semester, and then look ahead and see when those big windows of crunch time, lots of deadlines, so that you can plan backward from that and try not to maybe be as stressed out when all those deadlines are looming. All right, so next we'll talk about building and nurturing relationships. And this means relationships not just between me and my students, but also students having a relationship with one another. That's super important, especially if I'm trying to build a program where my students view one another as colleagues, both at WSU, but then also later. And so the specific examples that I'll share with you, I'll just begin first with how I use those tickets in the door. So you saw my examples of the tickets in the door earlier in this presentation. In my Core 3 class, I actually respond to all of those using just a little email to each student. And so obviously they're different for each student. I've got a couple of samples. But this particular student had written to me and shared that she was dealing with some classroom management issues and in her internship, and was kind of stressed about them. And she'd maybe kind of put her foot in her mouth a little bit. And so just responding to that and encouraging her to recognize that, this is a learning experience. You may mess up sometimes, and that's going to be okay. In another example, a student had shared a personal loss, the death of a friend, and so just responding to that and showing that, yes, I actually am reading these, I do care about you. If you need anything, I'm here to help you. Another way that I use those tickets in the door, this is an example, and I don't expect that you'll be able to read the text on this at all, so I'll just kind of walk you through it. This is an example from my young adult literature class where students in the ticket in the door, they write about just what are their reading preferences, what experiences do they have with young adult literature, what are they currently reading. And so I just create a little Word document chart. Student names are obviously removed from what you're seeing, but it has where they're from, what their major is, since some of my students may not be English education in that class. And then just really quick notes for myself on each of those items, their reading preferences, their experiences with young adult literature, their current reading, any needs that they might have. And then that way, and this is one page out of, I think, 3 pages for that class. So I have this really quick reference then that allows me to kind of just go, oh yeah, so-and-so, and they're reading this. And so then before class, I might be able to talk with them and say, oh, how are you enjoying that book? Or if they have certain types of reading they like to do, I could make book recommendations to them. So this just gives me a really handy framework for being able to see a bunch of students at once and then try to make connections with them. Another strategy that I use to help students build relationships with one another is probably about 50% of the time, I put them in groups. So half the time they can come to my class, they can sit wherever they want, they can sit with their regular cohorts, and some of my students do like to mix it up and they sit in different places each time, but most of my students will sit in the same spot, which that's what I did too. So I don't have any problem with that. But I do want them to get to know other people, especially once they're in their cohort, because I want them to be able to reach out to one another, ask for help, feel safe taking risks and sharing ideas and getting feedback from one another. So I very purposefully will group them up, and the groups change throughout the semester, so they're getting lots of different perspectives. This is an example from my Core 2 class, and this is actually from just this past week. Students arrived, they were assigned to groups, they could see the groups up on the screen. At each table I had put a number so they knew where to go in the room. And then, let's see. And then, since it was the second day of class, second week of class, we just meet once a week, I wanted them to just get to know one another, like let's share something really quick. What's some joyful thing that happened to you this past week? Keep it light, just kind of getting to know one another. And then after that, I had them get a little bit deeper into sort of academic things, and then just literacies related to study and reading. And I had them just, think about their academic reading and talk about their process for constructing meaning from text. A lot of them, got their textbooks out so they could kind of talk about how they annotate the text. In this particular textbook that we use in Core 2 has really wide margins, so it's really handy for like taking notes and using sticky notes. And some of my students are just adamant they don't mark in books at all, but they'll use sticky notes. And then other students had very strategic systems of, I highlight the things that stand out to me, and then I underline the things that I'm confused about and I want to come back to. And just hearing how other scholars approach a text and construct meaning from it can inform your own practice. And that's what I want to highlight for them. So again, just getting to know one another really quickly, but thinking about themselves as scholars. This is kind of just a changing direction now a little bit. So just talking about this idea of sharing our stories. As future teachers, I want my students to be really comfortable not just talking about their like victory narratives and like, what did I do that was awesome in the classroom today, but also where am I struggling, and be able to share that with one another and feel safe doing that. So on this particular, I'm not going to go into all these examples here, but what I will share is that in my own practice, in my own sharing of stories with students, I often find that it's my challenges and my mistakes that I've made as a teacher, and if I share those stories, those can be so much more instructive for my students. So describing a time when I was teaching middle school and I approached a student in a way that was not as respectful as it should have been, and that student sort of calling me out on it, like that's a story that I should share so that my students can see kind of the error of my ways, see how I approach that, and then try to let that inform their own practice. The other thing is that the stories that we share don't just have to be about academia and about our teaching practice. And so, for example, this also is from a recent class meeting. My students are just getting acquainted with teaching for understanding, teaching for deep understanding, and this idea of backward design. And so one of the outcomes for that class meeting was that they would be able to explain backward design in their own words, and then also apply it to some other aspect of their life. And so what I did was, after they had all shared, I shared my own kind of explanation of how I would describe backward design. And then when I applied it to my life, I shared a little bit about my experience as a triathlete and just setting goals for a particular distance in that race, an Olympic distance triathlon, and how I would sort of work backwards from that goal, determine how I would assess my performance, and then devise some kind of training plan for that. And so, when you share something about yourself that's a little, not what they're expecting you to talk about in terms of like, teaching and whatnot, I think it kind of lets them see you in a different light. And so when they run into you at the Y or the Heskett Center, they're like, oh yeah, are you training for your triathlon? The other thing that I try to encourage in my program and actually structure into my program is the graduates of my program mentoring current students. So one example of that is in May, my students who are graduating have a workshop that they host for the incoming seniors. And this actually was a brainchild of my 2015 graduating class. They wanted to do one. I had never even thought of it. So they created this workshop, and then each class thereafter, I have encouraged it now because I think it is a really good idea, but each class thereafter has been very enthusiastic about designing the workshop. And it's gone from, first it was just kind of a panel, and then all the incoming students were out there listening to the panel, and it's transformed into kind of small groups where the groups rotate from station to station and talk about various aspects of that final year in the program. Another way that I encourage my graduates to mentor current students is by bringing them back after they're in their first year of teaching or in grad school. Some of them are in grad school, bringing them back to talk about those experiences on a job search panel or a panel of sort of first-year teachers or people who are in their first year of graduate studies and what that was like. And then, of course, I've been here for 10 years, so my students that have graduated from my program are now serving as mentor teachers for my current students, which is an amazing, amazing experience right in and of itself. And so finally, we're going to get to designing effective instruction. And my goal with this is just always to make the goals for deep understanding very clear to my students throughout the program, in every class meeting, and in every opportunity that I have to assess their performance and provide feedback. So we'll look at several examples, and I will try to be mindful of the time. So you've seen some of my first slides for class. This is an example from my Core 3 class. And you can see I've got an agenda, and you've probably seen that in some of the other slides as well. Students always have a sense of the trajectory of where we're going to be going in class. And I also try in presenting that agenda to them to inquire and say, is there anything that we're missing from this? Is there anything that we should be addressing in today's class that I have failed to plan for, so that they can contribute to that thought? And then we move on and we look at, what is the goal for deep understanding today? We have an essential question that sort of guides our inquiry for that class meeting. And then we have objectives for learning. So thinking about this is the deep understanding that you're going to be demonstrating today, and demonstrating it through writing and through small group discussion in this case. And this is something that we ask our students to do out in the field too when they are teaching, is to make clear the learning goals for their own students. So I'm just trying to model that for them. One of the one of the things that I kind of always rely on in my class, I guess, is in-class talk. So doing a presentation like this is pretty foreign to me in my own teaching, and my students are very often going to be talking in small groups, but I do structure it. So there's usually going to be a question or a prompt. Sometimes it's one that I have devised. Sometimes it's one that students have devised. And then I'm going to give them time to reflect independently, because I want them to have a chance to figure out how they feel about it before the person that likes to talk the most jumps into the conversation. So they do some writing and reflection, and then typically they're going to move into small groups to talk. So that can increase the chance for them to engage really productively. And again, my classes are 15 to 25, so I can very easily move about and listen in on that talk, and I do. And when students first get to know me and I kind of like sidle up to their conversation, I'll get looks like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, it's okay, it's all right, just keep talking, just ignore me. Because my goal is not to hijack that conversation. My goal is to assess the understandings that they have, and to be present if there's a misconception, I can certainly address that. But my goal is to listen. And gradually they get used to that and they just ignore me and they keep talking. And then we may move into whole class discussion. Whole class discussion has the least opportunity for students to be overtly engaged, and it can tend to have kind of those dominant voices kind of take over. And so I have some structures in place that I'll get to in just a moment for that. But an alternative to this may be, instead of students talking in small groups right away, I may have them stand up and move to a different part of the room to indicate their stance on whatever the question was. So if you agree, stand up and go to this side. If you disagree, go to this side. Now you're going to talk in small groups about why you have chosen this stance. And then after that, you're going to debate and see if you can get anyone to come to your side of the room, or we may be in four corners, adjusting or trying to negotiate our stances on various topics related to English education. You've kind of seen some slides about this already before, but just again, reminding like, what does that discussion look like? And so this is not something that I just do on the first day. It's something that as I watch them interact in small groups and I see things that need to be addressed in terms of attention and engagement, I am going to remind them. So I'm just gonna hit the last two on this slide. So item number 4, allowing time for silence. It's okay if your small group is needing a chance just to kind of reflect and look at the text. You don't have to be talking the whole time. They'll get kind of nervous if I walk over and I like sit down and then they're quiet and they're like, we need to say something. We need to say something. I'm like, it's okay. Take your time. You know, you can figure out what the next move is in your dialogue. That's totally fine. And then number 5, stay on topic. I rarely have this happen, but periodically I may have a group where they kind of just round robin their responses, and then they're like, we're done. Like, no, you're not. The dialogue is never over. You know, go back to your text, look at some of the things that stood out to you, pose a question to your group, like keep the dialogue going. Don't just say, we're done, I'm gonna look at my phone, or I'm gonna like start talking about an assignment in someone else's class. So I do encourage them of that. And when I state it and say it, I see people trying to achieve that and to really dig into the content or the prompt. So talking about whole class discussion, this is something that I typically move into later in the semester because I want students to feel comfortable talking in my class. And so we start off in kind of small groups, pairs maybe, and then groups of 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we'll move into this whole class discussion kind of environment. Usually I do try to structure it so they can see one another. So we move tables, we move chairs so they can see one another. I have them get their little name cards out again so they can address one another by name. And I do give them a chance to prepare. Like I want them to come to the discussion thinking, all right, these are some ideas that I'm ready to share with the class, rather than just cold calling and saying, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Because that kind of, it's a little deer in the headlights. And then once we get ready for that discussion, I give them some kind of help in seeing how it's going to look. So in this particular case, in this class, letting them know that we're going to spend approximately, 5 to 10 minutes on each prompt, that their goal is to make at least 2 productive conversations to the dialogue. And because my classes are small, I can track that. I usually am taking notes, whether they're in small groups or it's whole class. I've got a little class roster and I'm jotting down the ideas that I hear. And then I can bring those back. I can say, so-and-so mentioned this earlier. Let's really dig into that point. Number 3, I try to encourage them to use one another's names. That is a convention that I think kind of has gotten a little bit lost, and I want my students to be comfortable using one another's names, and so I state it as an expectation. And then also just, of course, you can pose questions that will move the dialogue forward. And then I think I'm almost done. Sorry, running over time. So then we'll just talk really briefly about authentic assessments and this idea that, and I think probably most of us are familiar with this idea that we're trying to engage students in real world application of their ideas. And so, for example, in my young adult lit class, the work that my students do, if it's not directly tied to curriculum design, like the teaching notes and the book talks, then it's going to be tied to something that they would do perhaps in terms of sharing their ideas in a professional conference or sharing them in a professional journal. And so my students write book reviews in this class, and I let them know who they can submit them to. For Kansas English, we have a young adult lit book review editor at Pittsburgh State. And so I've had students submit their work to him. He reviews it, gives feedback. I have several that are going to be published in the upcoming issue, several that were published in the 2019 issue. Also, one of the major assessments in this class is their Young Adult Literature Conference presentation that they give to us as a class, and we give feedback on it. But then I encourage them to take that and propose it to the State English Teachers Conference. I won't go through all these. I'm just going to say that the authentic assessments that my students engage in my methods courses and their practicums, they all feature an authentic audience beyond me. So they're not just submitting something to me, it's going to multiple audiences. They also all include constructive feedback from peers and mentors, including me. Of course, I'm the teacher, so I'm going to give some feedback, but I'm not the only one giving feedback. And then they develop in sophistication over the course of these 3 semesters, so that they're starting off kind of small in Core 2, and then their design or their execution is getting more and more sophisticated and longer term over the course of those semesters. Finally, constructive feedback. Just encouraging my students when they give feedback to one another, and also I practice this myself, that they need to look for the good. I think English teachers get a bad rap of like just marking things with a red pen, correcting errors, and we don't all do that, and we shouldn't do that. And so just making sure that we're looking for the good things that students are doing in their work, including my teacher candidates. And so I recognize you won't be able to see the print on this example that I'm sharing with you, but this is from my Core 2 class. When my students give written feedback for the micro-teach, I've asked them to comment on instructional design, assessment, management, and then on the top, it's praise, what has the teacher done well, questions, any genuine questions that you have for the teacher after listening to that lesson, and then polish. So what are your suggestions for improvement next time? And you can see I've designed it so they have to give feedback in every category for each of those elements. So thank you so much for attending today. If you have any questions or comments or ideas that you would like to share, I invite you to do so now. So the question was that in some of my classes, I do have my students come to class having read, and then I encourage them to do some writing in response to that reading during class time. And the question was, why do I not have them do some writing prior to class, and then we can immediately begin talking about it? And my answer to that is that I actually do that in some of my classes as well. So it's a mixture of different ways of responding to the text. So in some of my classes or in some class meetings, students do come prepared with something already written that we can then use for dialogue. But I also find that it can be really worthwhile to just take time in class to reflect and to use a little bit. My classes tend to be 2 to 3 hours at once. And so just taking some time to have some quiet reflection and rethinking about some aspect of the text that I want them to focus on, I find to be really productive. So I try to have a mix of both. So the question is, when I'm encouraging my graduates of the program to come back and mentor my current students, the question is, what do they talk about? So in the case of the workshop that happens in May, where my graduating seniors put on a workshop for the incoming seniors, they typically, in the last few years, typically what they've done is they've set up some stations related to licensure exams. That's kind of one station where they give some tips and insights on how to be successful with the Praxis and the PLT and those are licensure tests. And then also we have a performance assessment for the state. So how to be successful there. They may set up another station related to the job search, because by then most of my students have jobs for the coming school year, and so that might be a station. Another station might have something to do with just having a positive relationship with your mentor teacher, with your university supervisor, and that may be me, and I'm present for this workshop, so I realize that might stifle some of the conversation, but then I will also strategically remove myself at some point so that then if they feel like they can speak more honestly without me present, that they can do so. But those are some of the topics in that particular workshop. Yeah, so the question is, to kind of describe the relationships and the mentoring experience when students who have graduated from my program are now mentoring students who are currently in my program out in the field. So these would be students that graduated who are now English teachers and are now serving as mentor teachers for my interns. So that actually has been, for the most part, really positive. One of the benefits is that those mentor teachers are familiar with the program. They may not have had the same text because I revise the courses or we change the whole But they're familiar with the program, and they're familiar with what the internships look like. And so that's been a really wonderful benefit. Yeah, I'm trying to think of any specific stories that I could share about that, because I have a number of them that are serving as mentor teachers, and honestly, it's just been very positive. Yeah, so Mara's comment is, how do the teachers who have come from my program compare to mentor teachers who are not a product of Wichita State's English Ed program? I mean, I think really the only difference is just the familiarity with the program, because what I find is that, someone who volunteers to be a mentor teacher, for the most part, they are really excited about just furthering the profession and being leaders in the profession and helping someone grow into it. And so even if they're not a product of my program, I mean, they're still pretty wonderful. So the question is related to the professional blogs that I have my students set up during their final year with me. Are they writing from the perspective of a student, or are they writing from the perspective of a future teacher? And I would argue they're writing from the perspective of a future teacher. That's how I encourage them to set it up. A lot of times they'll give their blog a title like, well, using myself as an example, Ms. Cramer or Dr. Cramer's thoughts on teaching or something. So they're giving themselves their professional title, and then the posts that I ask them to share on that blog, I'll encourage them to think about issues or challenges or problems that they're facing in their practice, to potentially sort of tell a story of what that issue is without identifying information. Of course, they're not. I'm very strict about do not name your school, do not name your mentor. They can use pseudonyms, but tell a little story about that, and then show us what are you doing to kind of inquire into that issue or problem. So if you're facing let's just say a classroom management issue in the field, so not just, well, here's the problem I'm having, what should I do about it? And that's the end of the blog. No, you need to show us what you are doing. Like, what resources have you already begun to investigate? What have you tried out in your teaching, and how did that go? And then my students read one another's posts, and I read them. Their university supervisors read them, and they provide commentary and feedback. I also, on the really exceptional posts, I will get those out to a bigger audience by putting them on the Kansas Association of Teachers of English Facebook page, so they can get some audience participation there. But yeah, the idea is that they are growing as professionals. And the other thing that they can post on their blogs, we do some creative kind of writing and reflection in my classes, so they can think about their teaching experiences and then write about it in a creative way that doesn't identify students or mentor teachers. And so they post some creative writing on their blogs as well. And some of that has actually, they've submitted it and it's been published in the State English Teachers Journal. So that's the kind of writing that they do on their blogs. The question was, what other teaching techniques do I use beyond having students read and then respond and discuss something? So I try to use different techniques. I will say I'm like less comfortable with, for example, lecturing, and so I might call it like modeling something. So I will model my process for writing sometimes. Like, we'll do a writing workshop, and one of the things we encourage English teachers to do is to not just bring in like a nice pretty draft of their work, but to show it in progress. And so I model that for them and show them kind of a crappy first draft, and like, what does it look like when Katie's trying to generate some ideas, and then ask for feedback from them. Another thing that I've done, or that and I'll probably do this semester as well, is model my own inquiry and new understandings of ideas. And so, in my Core 2 class, my students are going to be reading a novel called All American Boys, which one of my colleagues is familiar with. And they're gonna, think about the ways that race and racism and privilege impact education and impact how we perceive one another, and that's not an area that I am an expert in. And so modeling for them sort of my own learning process and my own inquiry into it, and having them pose questions that they're wondering about, and posing my own questions that I'm wondering about, and then kind of looking for, well, what resources are going to be helpful in answering those questions. Does that help? Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing your ideas and your questions with me. I appreciate it.